Ancient cannabis spiritual use, ceremonial cannabis, spiritual awakening ritual, entheogenic cannabis history, divine connection through cannabis. What if a plant was revered not just as medicine, but as a bridge to the divine? Cannabis wasn't just an herb to early societies, it was a sacred catalyst. In India, the Atharva Veda, circa 1500 to 1000 BCE, calls bhang one of 5 sacred plants that liberate us from anxiety, calling it a liberator, joy giver, and source of spiritual release. Ancient Taoist mystics used cannabis smoke in incense burners to induce visionary trances and commune with immortals. In Central Asia, shamans buried with cannabis signifies its vital role in rituals involving the afterlife. 2,700-year-old shamans entombed with cannabis still intact. So yes, cannabis was a spiritual tool, a bridge for healing, insight, and divine connection. Do you believe an ancient plant could still guide consciousness today? Comment below. Have you ever used or felt drawn to plants for spiritual awakening? Like if this reframes cannabis entirely. Share to spark introspection in others. Save to ponder this ancient spiritual lineage later. In part 2, we're diving into Hindu spiritual traditions, how cannabis was woven into devotional rites, meditation, and the worship of Shiva. Stay tuned, it's going to clear your mind. Cannabis in Hinduism. Shiva and bhang. Ancient Indian spirituality, sacred plant rituals, spiritual cannabis use. Why would an entire civilization link cannabis to a god of destruction and rebirth? In ancient India, cannabis wasn't feared, it was worshipped. Hindus believed the god Shiva consumed bhang, a drink made from cannabis, to deepen his meditation and escape worldly illusion, Maya. During the festival of Mahashivaratri, devotees still drink bhang in his honor, believing it opens the third eye and draws them closer to divine consciousness. The Atharva Veda even listed cannabis as one of the 5 sacred plants gifted by the gods. But it wasn't just about altered states, it was about spiritual clarity. Cannabis, for ancient Indians, was a tool to silence the mind and dissolve the ego. Now ask yourself, did these traditions misunderstand cannabis, or do we? Comment your thoughts. Do you think cannabis still holds spiritual potential in today's world? Like if you think ancient knowledge deserves respect, share this story if you know someone who sees cannabis as more than a substance. Save it to revisit this sacred history later. In part 3, we explore how cannabis shaped shamanic visions in ancient Scythia and how its smoke was believed to guide souls between worlds. Scythian shamans cannabis, ancient cannabis rituals, spiritual smoke use, cannabis in burial rites, cross-dimensional visions. Can smoke from a single plant become a bridge between the living and the dead? For the ancient Scythians, nomadic tribes of Central Asia, cannabis was sacred smoke, used not for escape, but for initiation. Greek historian Herodotus described a ritual. Scythians would place cannabis on hot stones, enter small tents, and inhale deeply, until visions came. They weren't getting high, they were crossing dimensions. These rituals were often held near burial sites. The smoke wasn't to forget, it was to connect with ancestors, with spirits, with something beyond the veil. Cannabis was buried with the dead, because they believed it would guide souls into the afterlife. So next time someone dismisses cannabis as just a drug, ask them, which part of your history did you forget? Comment, would you step inside that smoke tent, knowing what visions might come? Like if this ancient ritual blew your mind, share this story with someone who needs to see cannabis differently. Save it to remember how far back this sacred plant goes. In part 4, we'll explore how cannabis infused early Chinese mysticism and how Taoist seekers used it to meet the immortals. Taoism, cannabis rituals, ancient Chinese mysticism, spiritual cannabis use, Taoist immortality, entheogenic herbs in China. Can a plant help you dissolve the ego and glimpse the truth behind reality? To ancient Taoist mystics, cannabis was more than an herb. It was a tool of transcendence. In Taoist texts, It's recorded that seekers burned cannabis in incense burners during deep meditation. Their goal? To access realms where immortals dwell. These weren't hallucinations. They were spiritual journeys intended to bring clarity, not confusion. They believed cannabis allowed the soul to detach from the body, to explore the cosmic flow, Tao, and return with insight. In the mountains, monks would inhale cannabis smoke before chanting, fasting, and practicing internal alchemy. It wasn't about escape, it was about unification with the universe. So was cannabis just a plant to them? Or was it a sacred companion on the path to awakening? Comment your thoughts. Could cannabis really have helped unlock ancient spiritual states? Like if you respect these forgotten practices. Share this story if you think modern spirituality could learn something here. Save it for when you're ready to meditate on this. In part 5, we travel to the Middle East, where early Sufi mystics, Zoroastrians, and healers used cannabis to elevate the soul. Cannabis in Sufism. Zoroastrian cannabis use. Ancient Middle East healing herbs. Spiritual elevation cannabis. Sacred smoke rituals. Can a plant become a path to God when words and rituals are no longer enough? In the ancient Middle East, spiritual seekers turned to sacred herbs to go beyond thought into direct experience. Among early Sufi mystics, cannabis was used in certain circles to loosen the ego, soften the veil, and enter deep ecstatic states during dhikr, remembrance of God. It wasn't about intoxication, it was about transcendence. Zoroastrians, one of the oldest spiritual traditions, also referenced haoma, a sacred plant used in fire rituals, which some scholars believe was cannabis or similar entheogens. The fire, the smoke, the chants, they were part of a unified practice meant to awaken the soul and connect it with the divine essence. Even early Islamic alchemists and herbalists documented cannabis as a healing and spiritual aid, used with intention, not for excess. In this part of the world, cannabis wasn't feared. It was respected, even revered. So here's the question. What did they know that we've forgotten? Comment your insight. Could ancient Middle Eastern wisdom still guide modern seekers? Like if this challenged your view of cannabis. Share with someone who's never seen this side of history. Save to keep this sacred knowledge close. In part 6, we journey to Africa, where tribal medicine men and priestesses used cannabis to invoke ancestors and spirits of nature. African cannabis rituals, ancestral communication, tribal medicine cannabis, spiritual plant use in Africa, cannabis and nature spirits. Can smoke carry your voice to the ancestors? Across pre-colonial Africa, cannabis was more than a medicine. It was a messenger. Tribal healers, sangomas, shamans, and priestesses used cannabis in ritual smoke ceremonies to open gateways between worlds. The smoke was believed to summon spirits of nature, guides from the spirit world, and ancestors who had passed into the next realm. In some traditions, cannabis was burned during births, burials, and vision quests because it brought clarity and invited wisdom from the unseen. Among the Bantu-speaking peoples, the plant was associated with balance, grounding, and soul healing. They didn't see it as a vice, but as a sacred bridge. So ask yourself, if ancient Africa used cannabis to communicate with the dead, what are we really blocking when we ignore its spiritual roots? Comment. Do you think cannabis still holds the power to connect us to our past? Like if this history feels hidden for a reason. Share if someone you know needs to hear this story. Save to honor the sacred lineage behind the leaf. In part 7, we head to the Americas, where indigenous shamans used cannabis alongside other sacred plants in ceremonies of deep transformation. Indigenous cannabis use, Native American rituals, plant medicine ceremonies, spiritual healing cannabis, cannabis and shamanic traditions. What happens when cannabis meets the drumbeat of the soul? For indigenous peoples of the Americas, cannabis was part of a sacred toolkit, used in balance with other master plants like ayahuasca, peyote, and tobacco. In ceremonies guided by shamans, Cannabis was used to amplify visions, soften emotional barriers, and deepen connection with spirit animals, ancestors, and nature. Among some North American tribes, it was burned in rituals to calm the mind before entering vision quests. In Central and South America, it was sometimes infused in healing pastes or smoked before prayer, used to center the spirit before connecting with divine energy. To them, cannabis wasn't recreational, it was relational, a way to relate to the earth, the cosmos, and the unseen world. Now ask yourself, when did we stop treating plants as teachers and start treating them like threats? Comment your insight. Do you feel cannabis could still play a role in spiritual healing today? Like if you believe ancestral wisdom still matters, share to keep this knowledge alive. Save this part to come back when you're ready to listen deeper. In Part 8, we enter the forgotten history of cannabis in early Judeo-Christian and mystical sects, what they never taught you in Sunday school. Cannabis in the Bible, ancient Judeo-Christian rituals, holy anointing oil cannabis, biblical cannabis use, mystical religious herbs. What if the Bible's holy oil wasn't just olive and spices, but included cannabis? In the Old Testament, God commands Moses to prepare a sacred anointing oil. The recipe includes something called cannabis. Some scholars believe this term refers to cannabis, mistranslated, mislabeled, or purposefully buried. This oil was used to anoint priests, prophets, and sacred objects. It was considered a conduit of divine energy. In early Christian Gnostic sects, cannabis may have been used in baptism rituals, healing ceremonies, and visions. To them, the body wasn't sinful. It was a temple, and cannabis was a sacred key to open it. Even the Essenes, the mystical Jewish sect believed to have written the Dead Sea Scrolls, are thought to have used natural entheogens to enter altered states. So if cannabis played a role in biblical spirituality, why was it later banned? Could it be because it gave power to individuals, not institutions? Comment below. Should ancient spiritual tools like cannabis be reclaimed in today's spiritual paths? Like if this changed the way you see religious history. Share if someone needs to see this hidden truth. Save to keep this buried wisdom close. In Part 9, we expose how colonizers and empires weaponized cannabis stigma, erasing thousands of years of sacred plant wisdom. Colonial cannabis bans, spiritual plant suppression, Western cannabis stigma, erased cannabis history, sacred herbs demonized. What happens when a plant gives people too much power? For thousands of years, cannabis was a spiritual ally across Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas. But when colonial empires expanded, they didn't just take land, they eradicated belief systems. Cannabis, once seen as sacred, was suddenly labeled as primitive, dangerous, or satanic. The British outlawed cannabis use in India despite its place in Hindu rituals. French colonists banned it in Africa, suppressing tribal healing and ancestral communication. American governments labeled it marijuana to stigmatize Mexican and Black communities, connecting it to crime instead of culture. But this wasn't about the plant. It was about control, silencing traditions, disempowering the poor, and destroying access to the divine without permission. Ask yourself, why would spiritual practices that lasted millennia be wiped out, unless they threatened the system? Comment your truth. Do you think cannabis was banned because it was dangerous, or because it made people spiritually free? Like if this shook your view of history, share with someone who still thinks the war on cannabis was ever about safety. Save this part for when you're ready to unlearn the lie. In Part 10, we bring it all together. What the ancient use of cannabis tells us about reclaiming spiritual freedom in the modern world. Spiritual cannabis revival, ancient plant wisdom, reclaiming sacred herbs, cannabis consciousness, entheogenic freedom. What if the real taboo isn't cannabis, but remembering who we were before they told us to forget? We've traveled across continents and centuries, from Vedic priests to African shamans, Taoist mystics to Sufi dervishes, indigenous healers to Gnostic rebels. Each one saw cannabis not as a vice, but as a vessel, a tool for inner alignment, emotional healing, and communion with the infinite. Then came the stigma, the laws, the fear, the forgetting. But now, we remember, not to escape, but to reclaim, not to get high, but to get deep. This isn't a call to smoke, it's a call to awaken, to question, to remember, to honor what was buried. Because the real crime wasn't using the plant, it was severing our bond with it. So now it's your turn. Comment below. Do you believe the spiritual use of cannabis deserves a return? Like if you feel something ancient reawakening. Share if you want this truth to ripple far beyond you. Save to return to this wisdom when the world gets noisy. This was more than a history lesson. It was an invitation to remember the leaf of light and what it still holds.